The success of the Force Intervention Brigade against the M23 rebels has restored some credibility to the UN peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it also raises fundamental questions about peacekeeping in Africa. After years of being let down by the Blue Helmets, is it time to rethink the whole idea of peacekeeping in Africa? Joining us from Paris to put some perspective on the role of UN peacekeeping missions in Africa and to give some insights into growing concerns about their mandate is Professor Joaf Toka, an assistant professor at the American Graduate School of International Relations and Diplomacy. From London, Ben Shepherd, an associate fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House. And from Mogadishu, Abdirahman Hosh Jibril, a former Somalia Constitution Minister and a Member of Parliament. But first, let's take a look at ongoing UN peacekeeping missions in Africa.
The earliest UN mission to keep the peace in Africa landed in the Congo in 1960 during the Congo crisis. Since then, the footprints of the Blue Helmets have spread across the continent. There have been success stories, but there have also been monumental failures. Memories of dead US soldiers being dragged on the streets of Mogadishu in 1993 is the darkest reminder of the catastrophic outcome of external intervention in African conflicts by foreign forces. In his book, Interventions, A Life in War and Peace, former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan concedes that the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in which close to 1 million Hutus and moderate Tutsis were killed, could have been averted. Outcomes of UN peacekeeping missions in Africa have, at best, been mixed. The success of the UN's Force Intervention Brigade against General Sultani Makenga's M23 rebels is another example of a targeted operation. Yet these outstanding performances are far apart and are the exception rather than the norm. With a budget of $1.5 billion a year and employing over 20,000 uniformed staff, the UN peacekeeping force in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is today the largest peacekeeping mission in the world. But MONUSCO, as the mission is known, has struggled for credibility in the face of limited success and a disproportionately huge expenditure. Therefore, the relatively quick success of the Force Intervention Brigade over the M23 rebels in eastern Congo must inform a rethink of the African Union peace and security architecture. Despite some setbacks, the African Union has shown, through AMISOM in Somalia, that it is capable of conducting a successful peacekeeping operation. But the re-engineer itself, the African peace and security architecture, must begin by weaning itself away from external dependence if better African solutions are to be found to peace and security challenges in the continent.
Well, peacekeeping missions have been the norm in Africa since the 1960s. First, Ben, I'll start off with you. There have been about 21 peacekeeping missions in Africa alone since 1960 there. Exactly how critical have peacekeeping missions been in Africa? How successful have they been?
Well, that's a very broad question. I think if you look at the experience of a peacekeeping mission like MONUC, now known as MONUSCO, in the DRC, it's had mixed success. It was able to help bring some level of stability to a deeply conflict-affected country, but it's also come under a great deal of criticism, not least from Congolese people themselves, for not being as effective as it should be. I think the peacekeeping system in general is still, to some extent, traumatized by the experiences of the early 90s, most notably in Rwanda in '94, where it singularly failed to prevent horrendous loss of life in the genocide that took place there. So, sort of in balance and in very broad terms, I think the record is mixed. I wouldn't say that peacekeeping has failed. But it has been the victim, I think, of inflated expectations, undermined by a lack of consistent political support and financial support, and undermined by the politics of the Security Council. I mean, above and beyond anything else, peacekeeping is an expression of politics.
All right, Abdirahman, let me come to you though in Mogadishu though. Somalia has had a peacekeeping mission there since 1992. What's been the experience of Somalia there with peacekeeping missions?
The experience of Somalia in peacekeeping was actually a failure because after the intervention in the early 1990s, a multinational force led by the Americans came to Mogadishu, and they were widely welcomed by the cross-section of the Somali community. But it turned out that certain warlords were trying to block the intervention of the UNISOM, as it was called then. And after that, some of the warlords, most particularly General Muhammad Farah Aidid, started a campaign of fighting against the UN, and especially against the Americans. And after that, the Americans developed cold feet and pulled out, and the rest of the UN forces followed suit.
All right.
And I think that was the biggest mistake ever done in peacekeeping, because as soon as this was done, Somalia was left on its own, and a vacuum came out, and that vacuum has been occupied by terrorists and pirates since then, since the 1990s.
There's an emerging scenario, though, here, Abdi Rahman, because Ben Shepherd there was talking about the recent success of the DRC, which in the end, it was an African Union, a UN African force, actually, that ended the insurgency in the DRC. What would be the difference, though, between the peacekeeping situation in Somalia and what the African Union-led, the African UN force did in the DRC?
I think there's a difference. Here we have AMISOM, the African mission in Somalia, made up mainly of Uganda, Burundi, Kenya, Sierra Leone, some policing from Nigeria, and soon to be followed by Ethiopia. And I think the fundamental difference here is that this is an African-led operation, being led by African generals in conjunction with the Somali National Army, and they have done a remarkable job in a short period of time. But of course, there was the political and assistance from the UN, and there has been the logistical and financial support by the international community, led by the Europeans, the Americans, and other countries. And I think it's a very good model that can be followed. It's more similar to the models that have been followed in West Africa by ECOWAS.
All right, Professor Toka, though, that is a model that can be followed. Is the face of peacekeeping, though, in Africa now changing, given the fact that in the DRC situation, though, it was more a military intervention by the African force there, as opposed to the normal peacekeeping missions across the continent? Is the face of peacekeeping in Africa now changing?
Well, it's somehow difficult to globalize because, you know, the overall phenomena of peacekeeping forces, which is a relatively recent one in international affairs, is posing some great difficulties if you're trying to compare different political, geographical, contextual situations in different crisis zones, because the nature of this international gesture is a very peculiar one and special one. We're speaking about sovereign countries in the great number of cases, which are deposing parts of their sovereignty and interests in the hands of some other states or forces or organizations in order to accomplish punctual missions which are related to a conflict situation. This, in a way, involves a rather high level of voluntarism of all players, let them be active or passive, namely those who participate in such forces and those who accept that on their soil such operations may take place. So we're wide open here for all kind of differences and difficulties and sabotage and hypocrisy and many other sub-means in terms of tactics which may accompany the way those forces operate for real on their terrain. So it's very difficult to switch from the Congo to Mali, to Somalia, to other zones, say in the Middle East or in East Asia, in which such forces have been in action.
Yeah, but Professor, though, what made the African-led force, though, there in the DRC succeed, where MONUSCO had failed, having been in that country the longest with the biggest UN peacekeeping force there? What made the military intervention succeed where the UN mission had failed?
My answer would have two parts. The first one, and I'm not sure it's the most important one, it relates to the fact that according to African Union regulations, actually, once you vote upon such an collective intervention, you can impose it on local forces, which is not always the case when it comes to a UN resolution of that nature. But I would say that the political context in the right moment we're trying to analyze it is the crucial element. I mean, these would be political situations and combinations on the terrain which explain why at a particular moment things went rather wrong, and then another moment, at times the very same spots, they went pretty well.
All right. Ben, that one to you, though. You mentioned Rwanda as being the monumental failure there and DRC as being one of the success stories, though. What explains, though, the failure of the UN peacekeeping force in the DRC?
Well, again, it's a very big question. There's a number of elements to the answer. The first, I think, is a lack of a clear vision in terms of mandates about what MONUC and then MONUSCO was intended to do. If you look at the way the mandate of the mission developed from its first deployment in 1999, different tasks were simply stacked on top of each other. You know, it was supporting a political process, it was attempting to support disarmament, it was supporting a government, and at certain times it was taking military action to protect civilians, not as often as it should have done hitherto. In some ways, these tasks were mutually incompatible. It's very difficult to build the kind of relationship with an armed group you need to get it to disarm at the same time as fighting against it, for instance. It was also probably not given anywhere near the level of resources it would need. The DRC is notoriously a country the size of Western Europe, 20,000 troops, albeit the largest, most expensive UN mission thus far, is a drop in the ocean, really. And finally, I think there's a question about political will, and to revert just briefly to your previous question, you know, why has the Force Intervention Brigade, the sort of SADC-led African force within MONUSCO, succeeded? I think the simple answer is that it was backed with real political will, notably from SADC itself, from the countries that contributed the troops, which is South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi. And that political will was matched to genuine military muscle. So the South Africans have deployed Ruavalk attack helicopters, which are state-of-the-art, and you know, they were prepared and able to take the fight to the M23.
All right.
I think it's important not to overstate the importance of this, just very briefly, because the M23, to some extent, was withering on the branch. It was much smaller than the groups that had preceded it in terms of numbers of armed men and its effectiveness, and it was concentrated in a very, very small geographical area. So I think, you know, the comparisons, useful comparisons to Somalia are difficult to see.
All right, but can that situation, though, be replicated across some of the other conflicts at the moment? What would it take for that situation to be replicated?
Well, I think to some extent it is being replicated. I mean, you know, earlier in the conversation, people have sort of alluded to the fact that peacekeeping is now bleeding to some extent into this idea of peace enforcement. That rather than a UN mission going in as a neutral party to hold warring sides apart, it's moving towards, it seemingly, a pattern of external interventions under a UN mandate, even if they're not UN troops, going in as almost as a party to the conflict. To some extent, of course, that's dangerous, and it makes people very wary, notably in troop contributing countries, some of the traditional troop contributing countries, you know, from South Asia and elsewhere, who may not have the kind of sort of political commitments in Africa that African states themselves do. I think the regional economic communities and the regional politics of Africa is going to play a very big part in this. It will be local actors, local hegemons, taking responsibility for regions close to them, And I think they may be prepared to intervene in a more muscular way than the UN has been hitherto. So interesting developments.
All right. Abdirahman, though, going by the experiences in Somalia, where you mentioned that the peacekeeping mission there in Somalia was a failure, going by your experiences there, do you think the DRC situation is the way to go in terms of African conflicts?
Well, I think the way to go forward is there is a new doctrine in of the African Union calling for African solutions for African problems, and I think the Somali peacekeeping mission and the AMISOM in Somalia, the success out there, and also the DRC, I think that's a model that can be followed, whereby the African Union maybe can set up a permanent peacekeeping brigade that can be sent and made along regional blocks. For example, AMISOM now is the region, Kenya, Burundi, Uganda, Ethiopia to follow. And they do have a stake in peace because, as you know, the Somali conflict has taken on a regional context and also on an international context. If you look at the piracy in the Indian Ocean waters, and something along that line was done also in Liberia and Sierra Leone and in West Africa. I think an African Union-led peacekeeping and peacemaking missions is the way to go forward. But of course, there can be a role for the UN, and that's what comes after the peace is kept. We need to engage in building democratic institutions, like setting up constitutions, judiciary, human rights, and all the democratic culture that would actually stand before a civil war starts.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, gentlemen. Joaf Toka joining us there from Paris, Abdirahman Jibril Hosh joining us from Mogadishu, and Ben Shepherd joining us from London. Do stay with us. We'll continue in a moment.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
Welcome back to the program. Now, is it time to review Africa's peace architecture? And how can the international community help Africa establish its own conflict management systems that are not dependent on external intervention? Well, still with us on the program from Paris, Joaf Toka, an assistant professor at the American Graduate School of International Relations and Diplomacy. From London, Ben Shepherd, an associate fellow with the Africa program at Chatham House. And from Mogadishu is Abdirahman Hosh Jibril, a former Somali Constitution Minister and Member of Parliament in Somalia. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Professor Toka, to you there. Is peacekeeping still relevant on the continent?
Well, unfortunately it is. And by the way, it is not the only continent on the globe in which such interventions and such formulas are necessary. Yes, you know, what kind of analysis you may apply to regional or punctual situations, you'll always, whatever the military, geographical, economic situation may be in a particular crisis zone, you'll always have the political elements that are behind the scenes, which in a way down the road would dictate more of the characteristics of the way this crisis is to be developed and the way the international community, let it be in the form of a peacekeeping force or otherwise, may intervene and the chances for these to be successful. So the political situation is perhaps the first thing you should look at, and certainly the first thing you should look for in order to get clues as to what can bring about a successful progress, if not a solution, and what may mine and trap those situations and drag them into even greater tragedies than than initially were.
All right. Looking though, Professor Toka, at the situation in Somalia since 1992, at the situation in the DRC since 1999, is it time though to look at the way peacekeeping missions are organized and staffed and looked at across the continent?
Yes, of course, and actually there are efforts on that matter, let it be by the diplomatic community and certainly by scholars who are recommending and writing some very interesting papers recommending reforms and trying to study what worked well and what worked less well in order to advance. Yes, of course, but you know, even those would be conditioned to the particular situation in a particular crisis zone. It would be very difficult to pretend that there would be some kind of horizontal solution, horizontal recipe, even on the level of one continent, Africa for that matter, and that recipe following 3, 4, 5, 11 elements on this recipe may assure a success, because everything is so linked to the regional political structure, and even more so, as my colleague in London just suggested a few minutes ago, it's not only the overall political situation, it's also the overall share of power within local actors over the crisis zone.
All right. Abdurrahman, though, you talked about an African Union standby brigade. Why is it taking so long, though, for that standby brigade to be put together? Where are the challenges?
I think the biggest challenge lies in resources. The African Union, proposed African Union brigade would require a substantial amount of money and also logistics and equipment. And I think this peacekeeping in Africa or anywhere should be an international obligation. So the members of the United Nations should probably come together and resolve that angle, because I think it will be less costly to have an intervention, local African intervention force that's standby. But more importantly, I think the way of the future is also, you were asking whether we need to have a long-term solution of peacekeeping in Africa as a whole. I think what we need is to develop an architecture of conflict prevention, that we prevent conflicts before they arise. And the best way to do that would be for the African Union and also for the UN and for the international community to work on the democratization of Africa. Right now in our region, you have only Kenya, which has successfully adopted a final constitution and held a democratic election in a peaceful way. And they need to consolidate that democracy. But that should happen across Africa. And I think a democratic culture would certainly prevent conflicts. And I think that's where the answer lies.
All right. Do you see, though, Abdurrahman, do you see African organizations, though, starting to play a bigger role in peacekeeping missions across the continent? Or is that still being left very much to the international community?
No, I think that's what's happening right now. There is a conversation within the African Union to replicate what's been done in Somalia successfully, and also in West Africa, and right now in the DRC, to change that into a holistic African Union peacekeeping center or brigade. And that conversation is still going on there, but it just needs a political will. And I think it's going to happen.
All right. Ben, what would it take, though, for Africa to put together its own standby brigade, going by the experiences and the challenges that peacekeeping missions have faced on the continent over the last 50 years?
Well, I think the work that is ongoing to build the capacity of the standby brigades that each of the regional economic communities are currently in the process of developing will need to go on, and it will need to get deeper. The African Standby Force has been promised repeatedly over the years and been delayed. I think that the latest is that it should be ready to be deployed in at least some form by 2015. That's more likely to be in an advisory or observational sort of capacity rather than robust peacekeeping. So having a meaningful African architecture that's able to intervene across the continent under an AU banner is quite a long way away. That said, I think the pattern is very clear. The Central African Republic right now, there's a process ongoing to rehat force that was sent by the Central African Regional Economic Community. It's only 2,500 strong. It's probably not adequate to make a difference in CAR yet, but there's more troops going, and it's going to be under an AU banner soon. So I think the process, the dynamic is clear. All I'd say in terms of lesson learning is that I think it'll be very interesting once there is a genuine capacity for African regional economic communities and for the AU to use. The politics of when it's used, where it's used and why it's used will suddenly become much more important. And it'll be interesting to see if the kind of dynamics that we see at the Security Council, where people are very cautious to give the right mandate to a force for all sorts of reasons, see if that's replicated at the AU. So the politics is not going to go away, and I think will get probably more and more important over time.
Looking at the monumental failures, as we've come to call them now, in Rwanda, in Somalia, and the successes peacekeeping missions have witnessed recently on the continent, what do you see as the face of peacekeeping missions going forward?
I don't think we can compare situations across Africa as a like for like. It's obviously an incredibly diverse continent with incredibly diverse challenges. I think if there is increased African leadership, and I think, as we've said, that seems to be a pattern emerging, what we may see is more robustness. By robustness, that's a sort of polite way of saying actual war fighting. They may get involved in genuine violence. There will be a challenge up ahead, I think, both when countries begin to lose their service people. South Africa lost a number of personnel in the Central African Republic early this year, which created a political backlash at home. So whether the political will across the continent to risk soldiers dying, as again Burundi has in Somalia, I think that remains to be seen, and whether there is a level of reaction from the global human rights community, for instance, from other bits of the UN system, about the involvement of UN-hatted or Security Council authorised troops in actual warfighting. The level of appetite remains to be tested. So we're at an interesting point, but it's very difficult to say with certainty how things will look in a few years.
All right, Abdirahman, we're going to wind up in a moment though, but looking at the lessons that are being learned over the last 50 years, do you think Africa is learning any lessons in terms of managing its own conflicts?
Yes, I think Africa is learning certain things about managing its own conflict, and it has demonstrated that in West Africa, in the DRC, in Somalia. One fundamental thing that we learned is that the UN system is too cumbersome and too politicized to respond quickly to conflicts in Africa. And I think the best way that the UN can complement African peacekeeping policies is by working with them on the political level, and also by raising funds for African peace operations. But I think that African problems should be left for African solutions should be for African problems, and that I stand alone. African Union peacekeeping brigade should be established.
All right.
The sooner the better.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, gentlemen. From Paris, Joaf Toka, Assistant Professor at the American Graduate School of International Relations and Diplomacy. From London, Ben Shepherd, an Associate Fellow with the Africa Program at Chatham House. And from Mogadishu, Honorable Abdirahman Hosh Jibril, a former Somalia Constitution Minister and a Member of Parliament. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.